Hello, this is Kent Alexander, and I am looking forward to talking to Three Generations and Jane Wells about racial justice and accountability.
Can Josh take more? Here comes opera!
Hi, my name is Anne Troll. I am a workplace culture consultant. I am looking forward to talking to Jane Wells.
Well, welcome. And here we are live, and I'm thrilled to have Kent Alexander and Anne Roll here with me today. Welcome to the live stream. I'm Jane Wells, and I'm the founder and executive director of Three Generations. And today we're just tackling a small, simple subject, which is basically systemic injustice, and on and on. But I wondered if you would both start by introducing yourselves and saying a little bit about yourself, first individually and then collectively.
All right, Anne, do you want to go first?
Wow, yes, I would love to. Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Troll. I live in the western part of Massachusetts on Wabanaki, Nipmuc, Pecumtuck unceded lands. I use they and them pronouns, and I am the work partner of Kent Alexander, and together we help facilitate organizations towards anti-oppression frameworks within their organizations and within their relationships with each other. In addition to that, I also run a small beekeeping operation, so I can escape humans and hang out with the natural world a little bit.
Cool. Excellent. Kent.
I'm Kent Alexander. I also live in Western Mass. I live on Pecumtuck and Nipmuc territory. I am anti-racist workplace culture consultant and an artist. I'm interested in somatics, how the body houses pain, how we have moved through that or have not moved through that as people, both black, white, and all those in between. And, my work is centered on trying to eradicate white supremacy.
Excellent.
That'll do for now.
Okay. And just briefly, I'm just curious how you two met and how you came to work together.
Well, we actually met, if our memory serves us correctly. We've discussed this. We met at the Franklin County House of Corrections at another artist who was doing a show there, a hanging poetry show. And we started having a conversation, realized that we had some aligned values, decided to hang out and check that out, and then facilitated an event for a local group, and just found that we really enjoyed working together and thought it would be a really good idea to join forces. That's how my memory serves me right.
I know that typically at Mainspring Change, you work with organizations and with cohorts, but I guess today, maybe you can touch a little bit more on your ideas about individuals and how we can work individually and collectively sort of through live stream and through all these, we're all kind of isolated at the moment, even if we do in theory work in cohorts. So that was just a general comment. But something that I wanted to bring up with you, because as I think I mentioned to you in an email, I've been reading Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and it's so interesting how she separates out the issue of race and caste. And very simply, on one very simple level, she talks about how race is visible and caste is invisible. And I think, her argument is that the caste system in the United States is even more insidious than and deeper entrenched than even the problems around race. So I think I'm sort of curious how you feel about caste versus race, and if we can throw that in from the beginning of the conversation.
Well, yeah, it's funny you mentioned her. I had just looked up. She has the book Caste, Origins of Our Discontents, right?
Yeah.
And I like the fact that she talks about racism is an insufficient term.
Yeah.
And she talks about caste focusing on the infrastructure. And it's the infrastructure that we try to move organizations out of and create what we call equity frameworks, or the more accountant-minded might call them equity
Audits.
Audits, right? Equity audits.
Yeah.
But this focus on the infrastructure then says that the caste system is how we are locked in, and race then becomes the metric that's used to determine how much one participates in this caste system and how far one can go. So I think they're hand in glove myself. I don't think one defeats the other whatsoever. And I think caste does inform this because it's thousands of years old. It's in the European brain. And it helped invent concepts of race, I believe.
Yes, that's right. And another thing that I think she points out there that is, well known, but maybe I hadn't really taken it on board, was that all human beings are 99.9% genetically identical. So race really is a sort of, doesn't exist in science. It really is a sort of more recent construct. And I think it's really important that we sort of, if we're looking to dismantle a bad system, we also sort of find our common humanity and really honor that too.
Right, but I do think, Ange, I could see your brain turning with that.
Yeah, I think so. For me, when you first brought this up, the first thing that I equated caste was in the U.S. with was class, and that made me bristle, right? Because I don't want to conflate class being more important than race, especially at this moment in the United States. That race really is this thing that we are using to subjugate and impart violence on each other. And so I think it's important to, after we looked up the definition and got to talk through it a little bit, this idea of caste it's brought over from Europe, and it makes me think about the white body trauma that Resmaa Menakem talks about in his work, which is this idea that Europeans were imparting violence on each other before they colonized the United States and started imparting violence on Indigenous and Black people. And so it sort of ties in or threads in with this idea that we were already doing this to one another. And so for us to then transfer it over as quote unquote white-bodied people onto Black and Indigenous bodies was what happened because we never dealt with the trauma of doing it to one another and imparting that level of violence on one another.
And so scaffolding onto that is that this concept of creating race then, particularly here once chattel slavery began in this country in 1619, then what we get is the invention of white superiority in order to deal with what is called the cognitive dissonance of, oh my God, we're doing experiments on African babies. We're treating African women as if they're not human. We're enslaving these people. And the only way to reconcile that in our brains is to say they're not human. And so that, and we look at how these things happen with the Carl von Linnaeus and all these folks, even that guy who is the head of SIMS, right, who's the father of modern day gynecology. There's a statue of him in Central Park. And this guy did experiments on unethicized, non-ethicized Black women and drove awls into the skulls of babies, Black slave babies. So you see this race is used only as a bullshit metric to dehumanize Black folks and keep white folks in power without having to deal with, oh my God, my grandfather has created 600,000 half-caste babies.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of black and white or blackness is not really a concept that is felt at all in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa at all, because there isn't really the history of one race dominating. Well, no, that's not quite. We won't talk about South Africa, but it's not native to African culture.
No, not to African culture, but it was
colonized.
Moors, right? It was it was native to the colonizing.
Yeah, exactly.
Just as the Boers in South Africa, right?
Yeah, no. But so a lot of this trauma really does. I mean, obviously, so much of this trauma comes from colonization, and when we talk about colonization, we're presumably talking about means of creation of wealth, of which slavery was part, and the need for workforce and so on. So when we get to dismantling this in the 21st century, we have to also look at, we look at economics and who owns land and power of capital.
Yeah. And I mean, that leads us to, typically, even in our work, we hear white folks are very happy to have folks of color, particularly black folks, heal. But if you start talking about, well, we need to dismantle the wealth, then that's when you start to see, oh, no, now you're talking reparations, because they don't want to unpack whose bodies this wealth was built upon.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one thing that I've been, there's a lot of talk right now about sort of dismantling existing systems like police. These are things that are being discussed much more broadly than previously. And that really is sort of around creating new communities to solve existing problems. And I know that you two work a lot in communities and in building and changing communities. So would you speak a little bit about how you define community and what is aspirational for us all in creating better communities?
Ange?
I love that question. So how I define community, I think that for me, community is built on relationships of reciprocity. So relationships where we're both giving and receiving. Relationships where we have the opportunity for vulnerability, and that we're, as much as is possible in a very oppressive society, we're creating the safety to have that vulnerability with one another. And I think for me, community is about also this idea of curiosity and continuing to show up for each other, right? So what does it look like to be curious about somebody else's experience, and to keep showing up, even if it's sort of like hard to make a connection, or it's not quite coming together after the first time, because it's recognizing, especially as a person in a white body, that there's a natural distrust. So when I'm showing up in a community where people look different than me and sound different than me, I have to root into the idea that people with my appearance and complexion have shown up and failed communities over and over again. And so if I can show up and continue to show up and build that trust, which takes time, that then I can be in community that allows me to be in healthy relationship and not try to force myself down into people's lives or into people's frames without having earned that trust and created those patterns of curiosity and reciprocity.
Cool. Okay.
And accountability.
Yeah.
Accountability. Right. Because that's the other piece about being in community. I totally agree.
Yeah.
So accountability. This might be a good point, Ange, to ask you about, because you have so much experience as a beekeeper. I hate to use the term keeper and bee, in this conversation, but as a bee lover, what have you learned actually from the communities of honeybees that could be useful for us humans?
Yeah, great question. I think. So honeybees operate in like a social democracy. They build consensus, they communicate constantly. And that's one of the first things for me that comes up is constant communication. And they obviously communicate very differently than we do. But that there can never be too much conversation and communication about what needs to happen and what is happening and how everybody's feeling about it to process through it. So that's a big part for me is communication. And then this idea of accountability is sort of built into the honeybee structure as well, because it's a superorganism. Honeybees are a superorganism. They all work together for the good of each other, right? And so there has to be this commitment to each part of that organism, or each person in our case, committing to what they're going to do and following through on that commitment. So I think that's another thing we can take away from them.
Mm-hmm. So just to jump back a bit, so if we're talking about commitments towards communities, maybe Kent, you'd tell us in your life, some of the experiences you've had where communities have not fulfilled their commitments to you, or you've seen an absence of civility and justice in communities.
I think living in a Black body in this country, one is habitually living with these situations. I mean, I remember even as a child bringing books home from school that were so blatantly racist, my mom had to go up to the school system and throw a loud fit. And they would be all upset because she was so loud, but nevertheless, it worked. I mean, to me, it's like we live, I think, in this Black body. I'm constantly, to me, the communities, broad-based white communities, are communities that basically say, we only want a part of you to show up. We don't want your whole self. So when you join an organization, you're joining as a piece of yourself. The idea of being able to say, hey, this doesn't make sense to me as a person of color, or I don't have a complete say as this person here, and our jobs are level. I know in working in academia, which I worked in for a little over a decade, I watch kids of color being brought in from states to play a sport, and they had no support whatsoever. So once they were injured or they didn't make the team, they were cast aside. And why were they brought? They were Black kids, boys and girls, young men, young women, who had no support whatsoever. I just think we don't have support as folks of color here, and that's part of why you're seeing this roiling. Dr. King talked that everybody likes to quote, but Dr. King said, a riot is the voice of the unheard, and that's who we are.
And do you think, I'm just thinking about some of your sort of radical bona fides go back for decades, don't they? To when you were a student. Do you feel that this moment is quite different and distinct to when you first were active politically?
I would say that this moment holds the promise to be something different. What we see is, I remember going back when I was 18, 19 and watching people get shot. And when they, like at Kent State where I was, I think the U.S. was shocked that the U.S. was willing to kill middle-class white kids. They killed Black folks with impunity. They'll kill some hippies with some impunity. But middle-class white kids shot on national TV was a big deal. Things quieted down because they co-opted the schools. Hey, we'll give you this gymnasium. We'll bring this group in. We'll fund this and that. Now we're seeing young white folks who are galvanized by perhaps George Foreman. We do not know, George Floyd, but something has tipped. Whether or not this is maintained, whether or not it's focused enough and stays present enough for us to realize that, yes, Trump is something that should be dumped into the toilet and flushed a few times, but there was no democracy before Trump. And if folks can stay on this page and move all of us forward, then yes, it's different. My jury's out. I work for that change, but I don't know yet. It's early to tell.
Sort of suspending cynicism. I haven't lived in this country since then, but we thought that there was change. I mean, I guess people thought there was change in 1965, and then they thought there was change in the early 70s. And then with Obama, we really thought things were different. And now we realize how little has changed, right?
Yeah, I think Obama was a mask of it was like, oh, it's possible for us to be a certain way, but we weren't ready to, we hadn't done all of the healing work that we need to do as a nation to really embrace that moment. And it shows, because now we have the 45th president in office, really gumming things up quite a bit. But I echo Kent saying that that's not the root of our problem. The root of our problem is that we haven't dealt with our history of exploitation and slavery and violence. And then you pile that on top of the fact that people in my generation and younger than me, so people in their 30s and in their 20s and even people in their 40s have been systemically disenfranchised by their elders and told to pony up and like, well, this is just how it is. I mean, there has been a once in a lifetime economic crash every 10 years since I was 19 years old. So I think I'm going on my third one now, and I can count on one hand how many of my friends my age own a home, and if they do, it's mortgaged to the bank, and I can count on two hands the number of friends I have that have health insurance at the moment in a pandemic, and so you have these very real challenges, both historic and present day, of racialized violence and over policing that's been compounding and compounding and compounding. And then you have people who've been robbed of the things that they thought that they would get as they grew into growing up and being able to have kids and live in this country. And so I think it's creating, a sort of ticking time bomb. Like how much more violence and wealth disparity are people on the bottom rungs of these ladders who are consistently marginalized going to keep putting up with? And how much are people who thought that they were in a position of supremacy going to keep putting up with as they continue to also feel feelings of disenfranchisement,
Well, one of the things that actually got me wanting to read the Isabel Wilkerson book was the idea that I think when Trump came in, the thinking was that there were all these Trump, lower middle class, whatever, Trump voters who were voting against their self-interest. And what she argues is, on the contrary, they were voting absolutely for their self-interest, because their self-interest is maintaining white supremacy. And I think that that's a really, really strong argument that explains why we are where we are today. Because
and the fact is that 60-some% of white men voted for him, whose name I won't say again, and all those were not lumpen proletariat, broken down white men, nor the large percentage of white women. Folks were voting in their support. And I'll even take one step further, that I think part of the debasement of Black people in this country by white people, that there's a sense of learned enjoyment. I was looking at lynching photos earlier today, and looking at the looks on those, there's an inability to feel based on white supremacy's history in this country and what white body trauma brought over to this country, so that at this point now, us dying in droves doesn't really touch them at all, and so that's also part of this Trump phenomena, is someone who really gets to spill that bile out. And there's a lot of enjoyment. We see the enjoyment as he performs his Wrestling Federation act,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's pretty generous of both of you to talk about sort of the unresolved white trauma, because that may exist. And I suppose the argument would be that if that doesn't heal, then we can't really dismantle the creation of this supremacy. But still, in the short term, it's very hard to truly have tolerance for that.
I wouldn't say I have tolerance for it, but I like to point the finger and understand it.
Yeah.
Whether I tolerate, I don't. In fact, I don't like to tolerate anything except maybe my dog coming up to me sometimes and needing food. But in terms of white supremacy, no. But I think the only way to make sure that we undo this mess that we're all in is for white folks to own the fact that they're in deep pain and they need to deal with their trauma and figure out why they need to be as James Baldwin said, white folks need to figure out why they need a nigger. I'm not a nigger, but y'all got to figure out why you need one. And until that's done, there ain't going to be no change.
No, it's not. And I want to address this question in the comments about if we had universal health care, do you think that we would make a significant change in inequality? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I feel like there is a bubbling up of people realizing in this moment that that white folks are unhappy too. Middle class white folks are not satisfied with the system either, right? Like there may be some derived pleasure, some lack of empathy, some significant disembodiment that white people are undergoing and need to face. But at the same time, people are realizing how long that's been going on and how unhappy they are with that situation. Whether they're going to act on that is a totally different thing. I come from a background of people who grapple with addiction, and addicts will go back to the same thing and smash their face against the wall over and over again, right? So you can know a thing is true. You can know that you are addicted to white supremacy. You can know that you're suffering under it. And whether you do something about that or not is a different set of goals, essentially.
Okay, so let's talk about possible things that one could do. I just wanted to go back to one thing, which is the selection of Kamala Harris yesterday. How does that fit into the sort of Obama shadow narrative? I mean, is this just a sideshow, do you think, or does it help change anything?
The Democratic Party is not going to lead us to the dismantling of white supremacy. Liberals and conservatives benefit from the system of white supremacy, and they are not going to change it. Kamala Harris is not radical. I am thrilled that there is a Black and Asian American woman in a position of power, or potentially in a position of power in this country. I think that's great. She's not an ally to the queer or trans community. She is not an ally to people who have been incarcerated, and she's not an ally to abolitionists. So in this country, I feel like we are in this political space where we have to choose the lesser of two evils, which is such garbage, in my opinion, and that we are looking to that to solve our problems as a nation is just diluted. It's completely diluted.
Do I want to shoot my right arm off or my left arm off?
Yeah, like Chuck.
But I mean, that being said, we still all have to go out and vote for the Biden-Harris team if that's going to get rid of Trump, correct?
I participate in electoral politics in this moment as a strategy for doing less harm. I don't think harm reduction as a singular strategy is a solution to a problem. Harm reduction is exactly what it sounds like. It's reducing harm. Sometimes it's a little bit, sometimes it's a little bit more than a little bit, but it's not a solution to a problem.
Okay. I have to go with my brother Cornel West, who said, if I lived in a swing state, I definitely would show up and vote the Biden, Harris ticket. Here in Massachusetts, I mean, electoral politics is a sham. It's not democracy. I always vote, because I have ancestors who died for the right to vote. And I think they would reach down or up wherever they're reaching from and slap me bald-headed if I didn't show up to vote. However, I know it's a sham, and I don't think Biden-Harris is going to deliver me from any piece of hell whatsoever. But, so that's why I believe in local politics, changing things on the local level where we do have much more power for real. And yeah, I'd like to see the present occupant of the White House in jail. I think somewhere in a maximum security jail would make me kind of happy. That ain't going to change that much.
Yeah. I mean, I just, that we have a question here, which I'm going to ask you in a minute. But I mean, I just want to say that looking at some of the footage coming out of Belarus yesterday, it's very, very scary to see any kind of opposition shut down and closed down so completely.
Yes.
And if I believe that if Americans think that can't happen here, they are in full delusion.
But Americans don't think that's already happening here.
Well, I do too. But I mean, the point is that it can happen anywhere, and it has happened it has happened where people think it couldn't happen, and that's one thing we know from studying genocide historically. You know,
well, that's why it's important for white folks to learn things like about Tulsa, about all the attempts when Black folks had a little piece of something.
Yeah.
White riots that killed them, destroyed them, burned stuff to the ground. So no, but to answer the question here, who would be your ideal candidate? White. My ideal candidate wouldn't be a member. We would have to do away with this whole BS system of the way things are done. And running a candidate as a president of this country, which is based on stolen land, based on slavery, is not any paradigm that I care to buy into.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I feel like if I had to answer this question, I would say Stacey Abrams, but I also recognize that there's a lot of complexity in even saying that, and that again, I'm towards abolition and change and envisioning a radical new paradigm, and not continuing to, drive down these roads that aren't working for us anymore.
Well, I think getting rid of the Electoral College would be
a huge step.
That would be a huge step.
Proportional representation is another,
Yep.
All those. I mean, if a couple of those things could make a huge difference in America.
Yeah.
Doing away with electoral politics would make a major change.
Yeah. Okay, so well, we've answered the ideal candidate and why. So we were going to get into what possible solutions are. So you guys typically work in community. So how can we, as individuals who may be listening live or later, what do you think our best moves are right now? August 2020.
I would say, one, to educate, particularly for white folks, to educate yourselves about the history of this country, to really understand the damage done to BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, what white supremacy has wrought, the histories of it, how its tendrils reach into everything from healthcare to housing to medical apartheid. I mean, it's that great book by Harriet Washington, Medical Apartheid, a whole history. Norm Stamper wrote that book. He's an ex-cop who wrote an incredible book about how police think. That kind of education is important to turn people away from the mindset that says, oh, I don't know why these folks are acting the way they do. I also think in reality, what individual people need to do, particularly white folks, is look at the fact that where did your wealth come from? That investigate. How did your family money come to be? And more than likely, there's slavery, there's slave money, there's some kind of, and what can you do about that? What you can do about it is begin to understand how to have some sense of reparations. I really think that that's the move for white folks, as well as to stop trying to lead and move back and amplify the voices of folks of color, particularly women of color who are coming up really, really strong, queer, Indigenous folks, women, any voice that's not white needs to be amplified so we can move out of this old, tired, killing us paradigm.
Is there a book on Black history that you can recommend?
I wouldn't say there's a book. There's tons. It's, I said, medical apartheid is a history of experiments from colonial times to the present time. Okay, it's by Harriet A. Washington. There's The Color of Law, which is written by Rothstein, right? Color of Law is about redlining and stuff. The more folks understand this caste mentality of how this stuff was locked in and baked in, the more white folks might be able to understand, oh, They're not just making this stuff up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think The Color of Law is a really powerful book to read, especially in this moment of, we have this election year looming very above us. The Color of Food, that's a short book about stories of race and resilience in farming and agriculture. I think
Farming While Black.
Yep, Farming While Black. Thank you, by Leah Penniman, is an excellent book to read about the history of racism and slavery in the agricultural community.
Okay, then we have, are there any good documentaries you recommend for revealing an honest look at issues of systemic inequalities in our society?
Well, of course. Yeah, 13th, yeah. Yeah. Also, I'm Not Your Negro, which is 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah.
You know, folks could not do better than seeing both of those.
Yeah. No, I think, I not that I'm an exemplar of anything, but I do feel that every time I read, I learn so much more, and I learn how much deeper and more insidious, the injustices are to, particularly to Indigenous Americans and to, African Americans. And the more one learns about slavery, the more, the more appalling. It's just like you cannot learn enough, because the history we're taught. I mean, how slavery was explained to me in history in England was amazing. But one thing I learned just recently which wasn't taught to me at all, was how the Nazis looked to the American system of disenfranchisement of Black people as the model for their anti-Semitic laws. And that was just like a complete revelation to me. And I was taught the history of the rise of fascism by an American communist teacher in England, and that never came into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean,
another great book about American racism and the history of how things came to be is, of course, Dr. Joy DeGruy's book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. That book, there's also videos on YouTube that all they had to do is Google post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she talks about how many of these quote-unquote scientific theories, of course, came into practice based on no science whatsoever. The experimentation, the history, the laws, the fact that 8 of the very first presidents owned slaves while in office. I mean, not only were slaves, they owned them while in office. So what kind of equity did we start out with?
Right. And we are we are one of the founding nations of the eugenics movement as well. We cannot pretend that a lot of what Nazi Germany was didn't stem from seeds planted here. Yeah.
I mean, I think that they were amazed by. I mean, I've read that they were just they thought that America had gone further than they dare go. I mean, that's how entrenched it was, and that's a bit of history we don't hear enough about. I was just looking at the Angela Davis quote. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. So as we're getting close to wrapping this up, how do you each act? I want to ask each of you individually. How do you act, and how do you keep doing it day after day?
And you want to go first? Or you want
He's so generous letting you go first.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to go first this time, then. I mean,
ladies.
I don't know about because Ange is no lady. I'm more of a lady than Ange, I would say, right? So, I mean, how
be lovers first.
Yeah. So to act as one way is to tell the truth. Okay, to show up in the places you say that you support, right? There are no break. As a person of color, I don't get a break. I hear people go, well, I'm going to do the work and then I'm going to go away for the weekend. Speaking as a Black man in this country, it's a 24/7, and even in my dreams, this crap seeps in. So the way that I live is I believe in reciprocity, right? In my relationships, I give as much as I get. I believe in accountability. I want to be accountable for my actions, right? I also think it's really important to establish clear boundaries for myself, because that's how, in order to radically transform something, I can't let old habits that tear things apart bleed in. So that's a consciousness. And I have to make sure that what I'm doing is uplifting those who are underneath me and beside me, you know, and that's a constant reevaluation. You know, it's just like breath. And, you know, you breathe all the time. So to me, all these things are part and parcel, and always be open to learning.
Oh.
You know?
Yeah.
That's where I am.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think that we have to be able to hold vision for what a world that is not the world we currently live in looks like. And that's coming from Adrienne Marie Brown and the Afrofuturist movement, that we're really trying to, as people who believe that we should radically transform the world, we're trying to hold out visions for what that radical transformation can look like. And if that is true, then we're holding out ideas for mutuality, for reciprocity to exist, for for reparations and the redistribution of wealth to be something that we consider and act upon. And to do that, I think it has to start in interpersonal relationship. It has to start with with curiosity, with reciprocity, with those boundaries that Kent was articulating, that if we don't have those things in our interpersonal relationships, and then actually going even further back as a white person, if we are not doing the self-work to kill our ego, to face our, like, the fact that a lot of times in this society as a white person, like, I can get away with not being held accountable for my actions, and I can get away with it, and I can come out the other side unscathed. And so I can continue, I can move through my adult life and not be held accountable for my actions by my parents or any other figure in authority in my life, right? So when it's time to say, when I say I want to be accountable to my community, I have to define what that looks like. I have to ask my community what that looks like for them. I have to be consistent in showing up doing that work with community and in relationship. But I also have to look at, like, what does that look like inside of myself to be held accountable without getting stuck in shame and grief cycles where I'm like, oh, I made a mistake and I feel bad, and so I'm just going to sit here and feel bad and do nothing, or oh, I need to educate myself, so that's an excuse for why I can't build relationship. I get stuck in that cycle. And I think as a white person, I'm constantly trying to ascertain with my mental health counselor and with my other white accomplices, where am I getting stuck? Where am I perseverating? Where am I getting trapped in my own bullshit? And how do I claw my way out of that and break down the patterns that came to me from living in a society that taught me that I was superior to other people?
Cool. We probably have to wrap up pretty soon, but I have a question about sort of the moment we're in, a rather specific one, which is I hear a lot of white people saying, I support protest, but I don't support, violent protest or looting, and they have to stop looting because otherwise they're playing into our fearless leaders' hands or whatever. And I do not like hearing that, because we're already setting up, if he wins, then it's because they looted kind of idea. What do you think? What do you think about that? And how do we address that? And how do we convince people, what is appropriate protest? What is acceptable? I mean, why shouldn't people? I mean, I don't know.
Violence against bodies.
I would say two things. One is that, number one, this country was founded on violence.
Yes,
rape and pillage was stolen and maintained, and is maintained daily by systematic violence against Black and brown bodies. Speaking as a Black person, I mean, I remember there's a great quote from Angela Davis. They asked her about violence, and she said, my father had to sit on the porch. The idea that protest has to be nonviolent is not even possible in the history of this country. It's never worked that way. And to me, folks that believe that, I stopped arguing with people that believe that, because to me, if that's your belief, then you're going to continue and believe that there's nothing I can do as a person of color to change your mind. But you might look at the history of your country and how you got what you got.
Thank you.
Violence against people is not the same as violence against property, and we're conflating people and property as the same. Property is replaceable, it's insurable, it's not even real, really. And it's built on this history of violence and theft. And so it feels like a very white lens for somebody to say, oh, it's violence, so now it has to stop. But it's, so it's only okay for it to be violence when it's your violence perpetrated against somebody else. That's the task.
Those are the same people that probably want to keep the Confederate statues, because they're American heroes. But the fact that they committed violence against a sovereign nation themselves, they don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay,
well, so as it's sort of time to wrap up, but closing thoughts or what requests from us, what can we do? How can we get in touch with Mainspring Change for people who might want to, and what final words?
I mean, our website, Mainspring, one word, change consultants.com is our website. We're going under some drastic changes, so we're going to have an updated, so it is, as they usually say, under construction, but they can certainly email us there and we'll get it.
Yeah, excellent.
Parting shots is do your homework and realize that white supremacy is unhealthy for everybody.
Okay.
That it's not just unhealthy for folks of color. It's killing everyone.
We do have one last question. How long do you call open season on a group of people without consequences or accountability before they react violently? Those who are trying to separate the rioters and looters from the real peaceful protesters sound eerily like white Southerners during the civil rights movement who tried to blame the... it's all one and the same movement.
Yep.
Right on.
Okay. I guess, was that a question? How long do you call open season on a group of people?
Well,
finding that out right now.
Exactly.
That's live action as it unfolds.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And final thoughts.
Kent surmised it. You can find us on our website, mainspringchangeconsultants.com. And, there's a contact form on there if you want to reach us. And my fellow white folks, I just call you to action instead of book groups, I think. What are you going to do? Read. I mean, reading is important. Learning is important. And you shouldn't rely on the Black and brown people in your life to do that work for you. At the same time, you need to get out and do something. And that something can look like building relationships, uplifting businesses or colleagues of color. And it can look like paying reparations. It can look like paying both individuals and organizations because you have the means to do that. And you should give until it feels uncomfortable. So you should be asking how you can structure your life so that your giving can be consistent and that it can be on your learning edge, as I like to think about it.
Cool.
Okay. Stay on your learning edge in all your actions, right? If you're comfortable, you're complicit.
Okay. Thank you both very much.
Thank you,
so much to talk about. I hope we can come back and do this again.
That would be great.
Maybe after November 3rd and around January 20th or maybe January 21st. We need to see how the dust settles.
If it settles.
If it settles, yeah. Otherwise, meet you in Belarus. Belarus on Hudson. Thank you very much. It's really been an honor and a pleasure. I mean, and a lot of fun to talk to both of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
And all the information will be in the comments on the side for anybody who books and a link to you.
Thank you all who attended.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.